Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a Switzerland that doesn't look like postcard calendars with mountains and happy cows, but into villages where the air smells faintly of wood smoke, the streets are dim, and the rules are, well, kind of ridiculous. Picture yourself stepping onto a cobblestone lane at dusk. Lanterns swing in the breeze, shadows stretch across half-timbered houses, and you can hear the creak of shutters being pulled closed. You might think, what a peaceful place to wander. But then a stern town official in a woolen cloak appears, holding a ledger, and he's ready to fine you for the crime of walking without a candle. That's right. Night in the old Swiss Confederacy wasn't just about getting your beauty sleep. It was about curfews, lanterns, and rules so detailed you probably wouldn't survive a week without owing someone money. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing how far this sleepy caravan of listeners stretches across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down the medieval Swiss lane, hearing the muffled sound of cowbells in the distance, and the first thing you notice is how dark it gets once the sun dips behind the Alps. No street lamps, no neon signs, no glow from smartphones. Just you, a patchy moon, and the fear of tripping on an uneven stone. The Confederacy's towns decided long ago that the best way to keep order was to make night itself dangerous, unless you carried a lantern. These weren't fancy oil lamps. Most were simple iron frames with glass or horn panes. If you wanted to visit a neighbor after dark, you'd better be carrying one, or the town guard could swoop in, note your name, and issue a fine. The rule wasn't just about light, it was about surveillance. Lanterns meant everyone could see who you were. Imagine trying to sneak out for a midnight snack or a secret tryst. Your bobbing flame would betray you from 2 streets away. Historians still argue whether these lantern laws were about genuine safety, reducing fire hazards, or just giving officials another way to control daily life. Either way, you walking around in the dark was considered suspicious, even borderline criminal. Curfews layered on top of this. Bells tolled at dusk, echoing off the stone walls, and townsfolk understood. Shutters closed, doors locked, and nobody outside unless you had official business. A blacksmith might be allowed to check on his forge, a midwife could hurry to a birth, but you, the ordinary wanderer, would be told to scurry back to your straw mattress. Break curfew once, you'd get a warning. Twice, you'd pay a fine. 3 times, and you might end up in a cold town cell thinking about your life choices. And don't imagine those cells had pillows. The strangest part? Towns often had different curfews depending on the season. In summer, when evenings stretched longer, you could stay out a little later. In winter, when darkness fell by 4, you were expected to be indoors practically before supper. Farmers complained, cows don't check clocks before deciding to give birth, and woodcutters sometimes needed the extra daylight. But rules were rules, and the officials loved their bells. One mainstream fact here is that records from Zurich in the late Middle Ages show entire ordinances dedicated to night order. Who could ring bells, how long they should toll, and how many guards had to patrol after the curfew rang. This wasn't some casual suggestion. It was written law, backed by penalties that filled town coffers. On the quirky side, some villages actually allowed exceptions for weddings. If your marriage feast ran late, the authorities could grant a special lantern permit. Picture the romance. You and your guests parading through the night with torches, the one time it was legal to be loud, merry, and illuminated. The catch? You had to pay extra for the privilege. Love may be free, but in the old Swiss Confederacy, staying out after curfew was not. Of course, all these lantern and curfew laws sparked loopholes. Clever villagers learned tricks. Some carried tiny stub candles inside hollowed-out turnips, trying to pass as compliant while saving wax. Others deliberately kept their lanterns dirty so the light barely shone. Good for hiding, bad for avoiding puddles. And then there were the risk-takers, who simply walked boldly without any light, betting the guard wouldn't notice. Spoiler: the guard usually noticed. You can almost hear the shuffle of boots, the grunt of a watchman, and the scratch of his quill as he writes you a fine. If you're thinking this seems excessive, you're not alone. Even then, people grumbled. Letters survive where townsfolk complained that fines for night walking felt like a cash grab. Historians still argue whether this was primarily about order or just revenue, an early version of the speeding ticket. Now, you're probably wondering, what happened if you absolutely had to be out? Well, there were exceptions. Clergy could roam to administer last rites. Doctors, if summoned, could travel with assistants. And yes, militia members could pass. But ordinary you? Not so lucky. Your best excuse might be claiming you were fetching water. Ironically, wells were placed in central squares, which often had their own lantern permanently hung. It was almost like the towns wanted to lure you into breaking the rule. Modern readers might chuckle, but think about the eerie quiet. No cars, no hum of electricity, only your footsteps echoing. Every sound carried, every movement visible in the firelight. The town guard wasn't being sneaky. He was practically the loudest thing on the street, jingling with keys and carrying a halberd that glinted in the moonlight. That halberd was more for show than for action, but still, nobody wanted to test it. And yet, not every place agreed. Rural hamlets often ignored these laws, letting neighbors wander at night with little fuss. In fact, some historians argue that the strictness of lantern laws was an urban obsession, while villagers clung to older traditions of free movement. There's still debate on whether city councils exaggerated dangers to justify their restrictions. Wolves were indeed real threats, but the bigger worry was human mischief, theft, gossip, or secret meetings. Picture yourself finally making it home after your imaginary stroll. You blow out your lantern, careful to pinch the wick so it doesn't smoke too much, and slide under scratchy wool blankets. Outside, silence reigns, except for the occasional clop of a guard's boots. Somewhere, a tavern singer cuts his song short because he doesn't want to pay another fine. Somewhere else, a farmer mutters about missing his chance to finish chopping wood. You sigh, realizing even bedtime was regulated. And that's the sleepy charm of this strange world. The idea that light, time, and your very footsteps could be owned by law. A modern joke might be that if you lived then, your Fitbit would constantly buzz, "Warning, illegal step count after curfew." You shuffle forward in the story, brushing past the sleepy guards of curfew, and now the sunlight is back on the cobblestones. Morning in the old Swiss Confederacy looks ordinary enough. Roosters crow, the smell of rye bread drifts through crooked chimneys, and children chase each other past fountains carved with lions. But as you blink at the colors in the marketplace, you notice something odd. Everybody seems to be wearing the same boring shades. Brown, gray, faded blue, maybe a dull green if they were feeling daring. Why? Because the Confederacy's towns loved their clothing laws. Imagine a fashion police. But instead of rolling their eyes at your socks with sandals combo, they could actually fine you for wearing velvet. That's right. Rules about shoes, colors, and envy ran deep. The system was called sumptuary law, a fancy way of saying, don't dress richer than you are. If you were a peasant, you couldn't wear silk. If you were a merchant, you might sneak in some embroidery, but not gold thread. Nobles had exclusive rights to scarlet dyes, certain furs, and feathered hats so tall they could brush against tavern ceilings. Historians still argue whether these restrictions really protected class order or whether they were just desperate attempts by councils to stop peasants from looking too fabulous. Either way, it meant you couldn't just strut through town in your best shoes unless the law allowed it. Shoes especially were policed. Leather footwear was a marker of status, and boots dyed black or red screamed wealth. Ordinary folk were expected to shuffle in rough clogs or plain hide sandals. Picture yourself working hard all summer, saving up for a pair of flashy boots, only to have a town clerk confiscate them because you looked too noble. It's like buying brand-name sneakers today, then being told at the mall entrance, "Sorry, you're not rich enough. Hand those over." There's even a quirky record of women fined for wearing bright ribbons in Zurich during the 14th century. Officials worried that a splash of color could spark envy among neighbors. Envy could spark quarrels, and quarrels could spark lawsuits. And yes, lawsuits were everywhere. People dragged each other to court over cattle, fences, even insults muttered at wells. Adding jealousy over clothing was apparently too much. So, the solution? Just ban the ribbons. Imagine living in a world where your shoelaces might be considered dangerous. One mainstream historical fact is that in Bern, the 15th century council passed ordinances forbidding excessive adornment in women's dresses, including long trains that swept the ground. These were not just fashion statements. Long hems were viewed as both scandalous and impractical in a city where streets doubled as open sewers. But rather than simply pointing out the hygiene issue, officials framed it as a moral danger. Long hems led to pride, pride led to sin, and sin led to fines. Plus, maybe a sermon you didn't want to sit through. Quirky twist? Some towns allowed exceptions for festivals. For one glorious day, peasants could borrow a noble's colors, wear bells on their shoes, and twirl in bright cloaks. But the moment the festival ended, they had to strip back down to regulation brown. Think of it as a medieval costume party with a strict return policy. If you forgot and wore that outfit the next day, the fine would smack you harder than a runaway goat. Of course, people found loopholes. A clever trick was layering. You could wear the forbidden velvet on the inside of your cloak, hidden from view, and then dramatically flash it open in private gatherings. Another was exaggerating plainness, wearing clothes so drab they became ironically stylish, like the medieval version of normcore. Historians still argue whether these rebellious acts counted as resistance or just playful cheating. Whatever the case, they reveal that humans have always tried to bend rules when it comes to fashion. The economic angle was just as important. Dyed cloth cost more, and imported silks drained money out of the Confederacy. Councils claimed they wanted to keep wealth from leaving the land, so they banned purchases of luxury fabric from Italy. But let's be honest, they also didn't want merchants looking as powerful as aristocrats. Imagine being a hard-working trader sailing across Lake Zurich with barrels of wine, and then being told your daughter can't wear pearls because pearls are above her station. It wasn't just snobbery, it was politics stitched into fabric. Shoes carried their own symbolism. Heavy wooden clogs marked you as rural, while sleek leather boots meant city sophistication. Some laws even required peasants to wear rough footwear at public gatherings, so everyone knew instantly who belonged where. It sounds absurd today, but think of modern workplaces with dress codes. No sneakers in the office, no hoodies at the meeting. Only here, it was the law, not HR, keeping track. And then there were colors. The most forbidden shade? Scarlet. Derived from expensive dyes like cochineal or kermes, it glowed like fire against drab backdrops. Nobles hoarded it, claiming it as their birthright. If you wore scarlet without the bloodline, fines awaited. Historians still debate whether ordinary people truly craved scarlet, or if nobles exaggerated its allure to heighten their own prestige. But in the sleepy glow of an alpine town, the sudden flash of red must have looked like magic. No wonder envy brewed. Picture yourself at the marketplace, stalls stacked with bread, cheese, and cabbages, everyone jostling for position. You glance around and realize you can identify every class by color and shoe. That guy in the muted wool tunic? Farmer? The man with subtle silver embroidery? Merchant? The one in dazzling scarlet with feathered hat? Definitely noble, and definitely smirking at you. It's a human barcode system stitched into sleeves and soles. Of course, enforcement wasn't always consistent. Some officials looked the other way if you greased their palms. Others relished catching violators, dragging them before councils, and making examples out of them. A young bride fined for wearing silk sleeves, public humiliation, a cobbler who secretly made boots with extra shine, confiscation, and possible exile. But if you were rich enough, you could simply pay the fine and keep strutting, which raises the sleepy suspicion. Were these laws about morality or just creative taxation? Modern parallels abound. Think about how today, certain brands scream status, certain cars whisper wealth. Imagine the government swooping in to ticket you for buying a luxury handbag without being in the right income bracket. Ridiculous, but eerily familiar. And as you let your eyes grow heavy, you realize that envy, vanity, and the desire to stand out are timeless. Whether it's ribbons in Zurich, boots in Bern, or sneakers in your closet, people will always crave the forbidden shine. The old Swiss Confederacy just wrote that craving into law, turning fashion into a battlefield of envy and control. You rub your eyes, slip past the rows of drab shoes and scarlet bands, and the smell of fresh bread suddenly floods your senses. Warm crusts, flour dust floating in morning light, and the earthy tang of rye and barley. It's breakfast time in the old Swiss Confederacy. But before you sink your teeth into that perfect loaf, you'd better check its weight, because here, bread wasn't just food. It was a regulated, inspected, and occasionally scandalous object of law. Yes, in a land of mountains and cows, one of the biggest worries was whether your baker had cheated you out of an ounce of dough. You stroll into a bakery, A cramped wooden shop where the oven glows orange and the air is heavy with heat. Loaves are stacked like treasure, round, flat, long, each promising to fill hungry stomachs. But standing nearby is a stern bread inspector, ledger in hand, ready to weigh each batch. Too heavy? The baker wasted grain and might face suspicion. Too light? The baker cheated customers and risked a fine. Either way, the poor baker walked a legal tightrope. Historians still argue whether these bread laws were really about fairness for consumers or more about ensuring the town controlled grain supplies. The result, though, was the same. Bread became a matter of law. One mainstream fact is that in Basel, by the 15th century, bakers had to bake loaves of standard size, often set by weight, and the town council conducted random checks. If a loaf fell short, the baker could be fined, forced to donate bread to the poor, or, in extreme cases, publicly shamed by carrying bad bread through the streets. Picture being paraded with your failed baguette like it's evidence of treason. The quirky side? Some councils didn't just regulate weight, they also tried to regulate taste. Too much spice or honey in your bread could be seen as suspicious, even decadent. Bread was supposed to be humble, not a pastry party. In some regions, it was illegal to add certain luxury ingredients unless it was a festival. Imagine craving a sweet roll but being told, "Sorry, cinnamon is contraband until Easter." That's the kind of bedtime heartbreak the Confederacy specialized in. Of course, bakers fought back with creativity. If weight was the measure, they'd play with density. A loaf could be legally heavy, but miserably dense, like biting into a brick. Or they'd shape bread in ways that stretched the rules, making loaves just wide enough to feel generous, but still slim in substance. Historians still debate whether customers actually preferred these clumsy loaves or if they were simply stuck with them. The fines themselves were steep. A baker caught once might pay in coins. Caught twice, he might have to give free bread to an entire street. Caught thrice, he risked losing his license, his oven confiscated, and his reputation scorched worse than yesterday's crust. Imagine your livelihood depending on a few ounces of dough, and you start to see why bakers had permanent frown lines. And then there's the open scholarly debate about why the Confederacy fussed so much over bread. Some argue it was about preventing famine. Controlling grain ensured no one hoarded or cheated. Others say it was about fairness. Bread was the staple food, and cheating customers was a civic crime. Still, others suspect it was about power. Councils loved inserting themselves into daily life, and what better way than through the very thing everyone ate each day? Whatever the reason, bread became a battlefield of law and daily survival. Picture the market square at noon. Bakers' stalls lined up, people clutching coins, inspectors patrolling with scales. A woman haggles, accusing a baker of shorting her. He protests, pointing at the official seal stamped on his loaves. The inspector weighs one, frowns, and scribbles in his ledger. The crowd murmurs, already imagining the fine. For a moment, bread feels like theater, with the whole town as the audience. And yes, people found loopholes. One was the communal oven. In smaller villages, families brought their own dough to be baked in the shared oven. That way, responsibility shifted away from a single baker. If the bread was too light, you couldn't fine yourself, could you? Another loophole was bribery. A friendly loaf slipped to the inspector might make him a little more lenient. A classic case of bread grease smoothing things over. The strangest twist comes from animal involvement. In some records, bakers were punished by having their bread tied around a dog's neck and paraded through the town. Imagine your failed loaf becoming the collar of a confused mutt trotting past your neighbors. It was humiliation, comedy, and punishment rolled into one. Quirky? Definitely. Effective? Historians still argue whether public shaming truly reformed bakers or just gave townsfolk something to gossip about. As you let the scent of fresh bread settle into your sleepy mind, you realize how much weight, literally and figuratively, bread carried in daily life. A simple mistake could ruin a baker. A heavy loaf could spark suspicion. A sweet loaf could draw fines. Food, something so basic, was chained to rules as strict as any court decree. And yet, people survived, laughed, and sometimes even thrived within these rules. Children still tore into warm crusts, neighbors still gathered around loaves at supper, and bakers still got up at impossible hours to knead dough under candlelight. You picture yourself there, breaking a loaf with friends, hearing the crunch, savoring the steam, and whispering a joke about how risky your dinner just was. Maybe the lesson here is that laws can weigh more heavily than bread itself. Or maybe it's just that wherever humans gather, someone will always try to regulate the cookies. Either way, in the old Swiss Confederacy, bread wasn't just nourishment. It was law, livelihood, and sometimes comedy. You wipe the crumbs from your hands, still amused at the thought of dogs wearing failed loaves as necklaces, and the story tugs you deeper into another corner of Swiss life: marriage. Ah yes, matrimony, that timeless promise of love, duty, and, let's be honest, bureaucracy. Because in the old Swiss Confederacy, saying "I do" wasn't just about the church bells and dancing. It was about paperwork, permits, and approval stamps that could drag on longer than the romance itself. You picture yourself standing nervously in a village square, holding hands with your beloved, only to be told by a grumpy clerk, "Not so fast. Did you get permission from the council?" Marriage wasn't a purely private choice. It was considered a matter of public order, economics, and morality. If two people tied the knot without the proper paperwork, fines, punishments, or even annulments could follow. Historians still argue whether these strict controls were mainly about stabilizing property rights or about keeping families under surveillance. Either way, Cupid in Switzerland carried a quill and a ledger, not just arrows. One mainstream historical fact is that by the 15th century, in places like Zurich and Lucerne, couples needed to secure approval not only from the church, but also from the town council. The reasoning? Marriage affected inheritance, dowries, and citizenship. A farmer's daughter marrying outside her class could disrupt land distribution. A merchant's son marrying a foreigner might drag wealth out of the city. So officials made sure every match was appropriate. Love might be blind, but the council definitely wasn't. The quirky side of this? Some towns even limited the number of weddings per year. Yes, they rationed romance. Too many celebrations meant too much drinking, too much feasting, and too many excuses to break curfew. Imagine being told, "Sorry, you'll have to wait until next year. Quota's full." Talk about putting a damper on your honeymoon plans. And then came the fees. Paperwork didn't come cheap. You had to pay to file your intent, pay to post bans, those public announcements in church warning anyone who objected, and sometimes pay again for an actual council stamp of approval. Forget flowers. The real price tag of medieval weddings was bureaucratic. Historians still debate whether this was primarily a revenue scheme or a genuine attempt to prevent hasty or scandalous unions. Consider the role of banns themselves. For 3 consecutive Sundays, your name would be read aloud in church. Does anyone know a reason these two should not be wed? It sounds romantic in theory, but in practice it gave nosy neighbors the perfect platform. Did the groom owe someone money? Had the bride's family quarreled with a rival clan? Out came the objections, sometimes delaying weddings for months. You probably wouldn't survive this process with your nerves intact. Picture a scene. You and your beloved finally receive approval, but the council adds conditions. Perhaps you must demonstrate that you own enough land to support a family. Perhaps you must swear not to marry outside your faith. In some towns, widows couldn't remarry without the consent of their late husband's kin, who were worried about inheritance slipping away. It wasn't just 2 people saying vows. It was entire webs of families, lawyers, and clerks weighing in. One particularly quirky tidbit: some places fined couples for marrying too quickly after a spouse's death. A widow eager to remarry might be accused of disrespect or, worse, suspicion of foul play. The law forced waiting periods, months or even years, before saying, "I do" again. Picture the frustration. Love waiting in the wings while the council waves a finger and says, "Not yet." And then there was the question of dowries. Without a properly recorded dowry, a marriage could be declared invalid. Councils obsessed over whether the bride brought enough wealth to the table, not for romance, but to guarantee economic stability. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on dowry was a form of protection for women or simply another layer of control by patriarchal systems. Either way, no dowry, no wedding bells. Loopholes? Of course, people found them. One was elopement. Couples would slip across borders into neighboring territories where rules were looser. Imagine trudging over snowy passes, lantern in hand, whispering vows under a different council's jurisdiction. Another loophole was bribery. Yes, even in matters of the heart. A discreet pouch of coins might speed up your approval, though risky if discovered. And then there was the clandestine marriage, performed by sympathetic priests without official paperwork. These unions were legally shaky, but spiritually valid, leaving councils fuming. The enforcement of marriage laws could be almost comical. Picture an official barging into a wedding feast to check paperwork, scowling at the musicians, and demanding the stamped approval mid-toast. Guests groan, the bride blushes, and the groom digs frantically through his satchel. Romance may be eternal, but in Switzerland, it was definitely conditional. As the story drifts, you notice the broader purpose. Marriage wasn't just about 2 hearts. It was about keeping the social fabric tightly woven. If peasants married peasants, merchants married merchants, and nobles married nobles, the hierarchy stayed stable. If someone dared to cross those lines, the council swooped in with fines or outright bans. Historians still debate whether this rigid structure prevented chaos or stifled social mobility. But the sleepy reality is that most couples simply complied, enduring paperwork and waiting periods like a medieval DMV line. Imagine lying in bed, thinking about love, and realizing that in the Confederacy, even your wedding dreams had to fit inside stamped boxes. The image is almost comical. Cherubs with wings replaced by clerks with ink-stained fingers. And yet, life went on. Couples still found each other, whispered promises, raised families, and sometimes even laughed at the absurdity of it all. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you realize that bureaucracy has always had a talent for intruding into the most human of experiences. Whether it's love, bread, or lanterns, the old Swiss Confederacy wrapped life in rules like parchment around a candle, and somehow people managed to keep the flame alive. You ease back into the cobblestoned lanes, your thoughts still buzzing with wedding paperwork and council stamps, and the air suddenly grows oddly quiet. The marketplace chatter fades, shutters close early, and you notice taverns with their doors barred shut, even though the night is young. You lean closer to read a faded wooden sign outside. Dancing forbidden on Tuesdays. Yes, you read that correctly. Tuesdays. In the old Swiss Confederacy, whole days of the week carried restrictions on music, dancing, drinking, and laughter, as if joy itself had to be scheduled like a tax payment. Why Tuesdays? Historians still argue whether it was linked to superstition, civic order, or just a counselor who really hated fiddles on his laundry day. Whatever the reason, these bans were real, woven into the daily rhythm of Swiss towns. Picture yourself eager to kick up your heels after a long day hauling firewood, only to be told, sorry, no waltzing until Wednesday. It sounds ridiculous, but to them, it was civic duty. One mainstream fact is that in Zurich during the 16th century, strict bans were passed on dancing and music during Lent, on Sundays, and sometimes on random weekdays. The rationale? Dancing encouraged drinking. Drinking encouraged fights, and fights encouraged lawsuits. The councils wanted none of that. They envisioned peaceful, orderly citizens, quietly knitting socks by the hearth, which, let's be honest, sounds more like a punishment than a lifestyle. The quirky side? Some places specified exactly which instruments were banned. Fiddles, drums, and bagpipes were often singled out. Lutes or harps might sneak through, but only if they were played gently. Imagine the absurdity of being fined because your bagpipe was too festive. You can almost hear a town guard sighing, "Sir, your flute is acceptable, but that tambourine is a menace." Of course, drinking was equally policed. Certain weekdays carried bans on taverns serving alcohol. The logic was partly religious, keep the week holy, but partly economic, since too much drinking meant lost work hours in fields or workshops. A farmer hungover on Wednesday morning meant fewer cabbages in the marketplace. Councils figured banning booze on certain days would solve the problem. Historians still debate whether these laws actually curbed drunkenness or just drove it underground, into barns and cellars. Picture yourself sneaking into a neighbor's barn, sitting on a hay bale, sipping forbidden ale while whispering jokes about the council. The thrill of rebellion is there, but so is the fear of being caught. Punishments could include fines, confiscation of barrels, or even public shaming. In some towns, repeat offenders were forced to stand outside taverns, holding an empty mug as a warning to others. Medieval Switzerland had a talent for turning punishment into performance art. And then there's the odd timing. Why not ban dancing on Mondays, the universal day of misery? Why Tuesdays? Some historians suggest it tied to market schedules. Tuesdays were often busy trade days, and councils didn't want workers too tired or drunk to haggle over cheese. Others point to superstitions. Tuesday was associated with Mars, the god of war, so dancing might invite unrest. Still others shrug and admit no one really knows. Historians still argue, and likely always will. Quirky festivals provided loopholes. During Carnival, restrictions flipped. For a few glorious days, people could dance, drink, and play music as loudly as they wanted, even encouraged by councils who otherwise banned it. But once Carnival ended, the crackdown was swift. Imagine the whiplash. One day parading with masks and drums, the next day fined for humming too loudly on a street corner. The enforcement could feel downright comical. Guards patrolled taverns, ears pricked for the sound of clapping or stomping feet. If they heard a jig, they'd burst in, quills ready to write fines. Patrons might try to disguise their dancing as exercise or stretching, but officials weren't fooled. You can almost imagine a stern clerk declaring, "That's not stretching, that's clearly a jig, 10 silver pennies." Yet, as always, people adapted. They developed silent dances, where couples swayed without music, relying on the rhythm in their heads. Others played outlawed instruments softly in cellars, muffled with blankets. And sometimes, entire communities turned a blind eye. After all, what's life without a little music? Picture a sleepy town square at dusk, with a fiddler quietly tuning his instrument. He glances nervously at the windows, then begins a soft tune. A few brave souls tap their feet, maybe sway a little. The mood lifts, laughter bubbles. For a moment, law fades, and joy sneaks through like contraband light. But the risk never vanished. Councils kept records of repeat violators, sometimes barring them from taverns altogether. A musician caught too many times could lose his right to perform at weddings or festivals, a devastating blow in a world where music was one of the few entertainments. Imagine your entire livelihood threatened because you couldn't resist playing a jig on the wrong night. And the irony? Councils themselves sometimes broke their own rules. After long meetings, officials might drink and sing in private halls, technically violating the bans they imposed on everyone else. Hypocrisy, it seems, is timeless. As you listen to the echo of muffled fiddles in your sleepy imagination, you realize how fragile joy can be when trapped under rules. Dancing, drinking, laughter, all needed permits or the right day on the calendar. And yet, the human spirit found ways to bend and twist around those laws, sneaking moments of happiness into the cracks. If you lived there, maybe you'd join those rebels in a barn, sipping ale and tapping your foot to an outlawed tune, your lantern dimmed, your laughter hushed. And maybe, just maybe, you'd think, if Tuesday's the worst they can ban, I'll take my chances. You leave behind the muffled fiddles and the tavern doors locked on Tuesdays, and the story steers you toward the pastures. The air smells of hay and manure, cowbells clank like sleepy metronomes, and the horizon is dotted with barns that look like they've been leaning for centuries. At first glance, this is simple countryside life. Cows chewing cud, farmers mending fences, goats hopping onto anything taller than themselves. But look closer, and you notice something odd. Each animal bears a mark, a symbol seared into hide or stitched onto collars. Yes, livestock here carried proof of identity, almost like passports. Because in the old Swiss Confederacy, even cows had paperwork. Imagine trudging into town on market day, leading your best dairy cow by a rope, only to be stopped at the gate by a clerk asking, "Papers, please." No, you didn't mishear. Livestock had to be branded, tallied, or otherwise documented before they could be traded. The reason? Animals were wealth, portable, and easily stolen. Councils obsessed over preventing cattle theft and controlling who profited from the booming Alpine cheese trade. Historians still argue whether these regulations were about genuine security or just another excuse for towns to rake in fees. One mainstream fact is that by the late Middle Ages, cattle theft was such a serious crime in Switzerland that entire alliances between cantons, mini-states, formed around preventing it. Branding became mandatory in many regions with symbols unique to each village. If your cow wandered off and ended up in another town, the brand was supposed to prove ownership. It sounds practical, but also a little absurd. Cows became walking ID cards. Quirky twist? Some towns didn't just brand cows. They issued little wooden tags or wax-sealed slips, essentially bovine passports, to prove the animal's legitimacy for sale. Picture a proud farmer fumbling with documents at the market while his cow sighs impatiently. Its bureaucracy meets barnyard, and yes, fines awaited anyone who tried to sneak past without the proper credentials. Now, cows weren't the only ones with rules. Goats, pigs, and even chickens sometimes required tallies. Councils demanded livestock counts, partly to assess taxes, partly to prepare for war levies. Yes, armies needed cows too, not for fighting but for feeding soldiers. Your herd might suddenly be requisitioned if the canton raised troops. So keeping accurate records mattered, unless you wanted a very angry official banging on your barn door. Picture market day in Lucerne, animals crammed into squares, bleating and mooing, while clerks scurried about with quills and parchment. Buyers haggled, sellers shouted, and officials hovered checking brands. A missing mark could halt the sale instantly. Farmers argued, swore under their breath, and sometimes tried shady tricks like forging brands with hot irons. And yes, counterfeit branding was a crime, punished with heavy fines or exile. Historians still debate whether the councils genuinely managed to track every cow or if half the system was smoke and manure. Another quirky tidbit. Some councils regulated the style of bells cows could wear. Large, noisy bells might disturb neighbors or cause unrest. So you had rules about bell size and sound, as if the government feared cows were throwing raves in the meadows. Imagine being fined because your cow clanked too loudly during milking. It sounds laughable, but noise control was serious business in a world without earplugs. Of course, loopholes thrived. Farmers sometimes branded cows with vague or confusing symbols, making ownership harder to prove in disputes. Others smuggled unmarked animals at night, driving them along forest paths to markets in distant towns. And then there were the truly bold, claiming lost cows as their own when no brand could be seen. These disputes filled courtrooms, leading to trials where witnesses swore they recognized a cow's face. Picture an entire jury staring at a cow while debating its true identity. Historians still argue whether livestock trials were reliable or just rural theater. Punishments for fraud could be creative. In some towns, a farmer caught selling unmarked cattle had to march around the marketplace with a rope tied to his waist, leading a wooden cow effigy as a symbol of his shame. In others, the fines alone could bankrupt a family. Cows weren't just animals, they were living banks on 4 legs. Lose one unfairly, and you lost your livelihood. You might laugh, but the seriousness was real. Wars were fought, alliances forged, and families ruined over cattle rights. The Confederacy's wealth, especially in cheese and dairy exports, depended on cows being counted, branded, and taxed. A single missing cow wasn't just a neighborly dispute. It could ripple into accusations of dishonor, theft, or treason. And yes, in some cases, people were executed for repeat cattle theft. That's how high the stakes ran. As you drift along this sleepy trail, picture yourself in a meadow at dawn. Dew glistens on grass, mountains loom in pink light, and a farmer kneels to check his cow's brand, muttering about inspectors. The cow chews, unimpressed by the drama of law. You wonder, did the animals ever sense their importance? Probably not. But for the humans, every moo was tied to rules, fines, and sometimes full-blown feuds. Modern parallels creep in. Think of car registration, license plates, microchipped pets. We still tag, register, and identify our property. Only in Switzerland centuries ago, your vehicle was a cow, and instead of an emissions test, you had a branding iron. The similarity is almost comforting. Bureaucracy is eternal, no matter the century. And so, the thought settles. In the old Swiss Confederacy, you couldn't even milk a cow without brushing up against the law. Paperwork followed you from the cradle to the barn, from your boots to your bell, from your bread to your bovines. It's a strangely cozy kind of control, absurd enough to make you chuckle, but real enough that farmers lived and died by it. So next time you see a cow lazily chewing grass, imagine her flashing a little passport at a medieval checkpoint, mooing softly as the guard waves her through. Sleepy, silly, but once upon a time, deadly serious. You drift out of the meadows, the sound of cowbells fading into a hush, and your feet take you along narrow, winding village lanes. The air carries a whiff of wood smoke, roasted grain, and faintly sour beer, the unmistakable perfume of brewing day. You notice a stone building with steam curling out of a chimney, and from inside comes the clank of barrels and the slosh of liquid. But before you wander in for a mug, you remember, in the old Swiss Confederacy, brewing beer wasn't just a hobby. It was one of the most tightly regulated privileges around. Yes, brewing was serious business. Councils feared unregulated beer would poison people, waste grain, or undercut tax revenues. Brewing without a license, punishable with heavy fines, confiscation, or sometimes a brief stint in the stocks. You imagine yourself caught with a secret kettle of barley and being forced to stand in the square, holding your ladle like a criminal. Not exactly the heroic legend you wanted. One mainstream fact: in 15th and 16th century towns like Zurich and Bern, brewing rights were carefully distributed. Often, only guild members or licensed households could legally brew. Beer wasn't just food. It was currency, daily nutrition, and civic revenue. Councils collected taxes on every keg, making it a reliable income stream. Historians still argue whether these regulations were truly about safety or mostly about protecting wealthy guild monopolies. And then comes the quirky side. In some cantons, women, yes, women, held exclusive brewing privileges for specific festivals. Known as brew wives, they produced special seasonal beers for church feasts, weddings, or carnival. Imagine gossiping groups of women stirring enormous vats, laughing, singing, and maybe sneaking tastes, while stern officials peeked in to ensure the right amount went into tax barrels. Brewing wasn't just legal duty. Sometimes it was a community performance. The absurd part? The councils controlled when you could brew. For example, brewing was banned during times of grain shortage, or if too many households had already produced beer that week. Too much beer, they feared, would lead to drunken chaos. Too little, and the town grew restless. So permits carefully balanced supply, like medieval micromanagement. Picture a clerk with a feather quill, scheduling who gets to mash barley on which Tuesday. You thought booking a haircut was tricky? Try booking a brew slot in 1500. The regulations seeped into taverns, too. Inns could only sell beer from approved brewers, and sometimes only at set prices. No happy hour, no 2-for-1 deals. Imagine the disappointment of thirsty travelers learning they could only sip weak ale because the council wanted to stretch grain stocks. Strong beer was often taxed higher, making it a luxury. And yes, some councils banned brewing strong beer altogether, claiming it led to immoral dancing and brawls. Remember those No Dancing Tuesdays? Strong beer was seen as their evil twin. Naturally, people found loopholes. Farmers brewed in secret cellars, covering kettles with hay to hide steam. Families sometimes diluted beer to avoid taxes, resulting in watery ale that tasted like bread-flavored rain. Others experimented with herbs to mask weak flavor, nettle beer, spruce beer, even dandelion brews. Some of these concoctions gave people stomach aches, leading to another layer of rules, mandatory inspections of beer quality. Yes, the Confederacy had official beer tasters, sworn to sample suspicious kegs and declare them safe. It sounds like a dream job until you realize one bad sip could leave you retching for days. Punishments varied. A brewer caught cheating on quality might be forced to pour out their entire stock in the street while neighbors jeered. Others had barrels seized and resold by the council. There's even record of fines paid in beer itself, officials marching home with confiscated kegs, pretending it was purely business. Historians still argue whether those officials enforced rules fairly or just enjoyed free drinks. Then there was the curious role of monasteries. Many abbeys held ancient brewing privileges, producing beer for pilgrims, locals, and their own monks. These beers were often richer, tastier, and stronger than ordinary town brews. So, tension brewed, pun intended, between monks and lay brewers, who accused each other of unfair competition. Some councils sided with monasteries, others tried to clip their privileges. Imagine monks in robes, solemnly debating tax rates over frothy mugs, and of course, beer linked directly to health. Water could be unsafe, but beer, lightly alcoholic and boiled during brewing, was safer to drink daily. Families, even children, drank weak beer with meals. Councils knew that if brewing collapsed, so might public health. So they struck this delicate balance. Strict controls to prevent abuse, but enough supply to keep bellies and tempers satisfied. Picture yourself wandering into a tavern on a chilly night, only to find the innkeeper nervously checking his permit pinned to the wall. He pours you a mug, weak and lukewarm, apologizing that strong beer is banned this month. Around you, travelers mutter complaints. A fiddler plays softly, careful not to trigger the dancing ban, and the whole place feels like a mix of rebellion and resignation. This is daily life, regulated, measured, taxed, but still, somehow, human. The irony? Councils themselves often broke their own brewing rules. Officials held private feasts with barrels of strong beer, ignoring the bans they imposed on ordinary folk. Hypocrisy, again, is timeless. And yet, enforcement remained harsh for common brewers. You could almost hear a peasant muttering, "One rule for them, another for us." As you step back out into the cool night, you picture the countryside dotted with hidden cellars, farmers whispering around steaming kettles, and inspectors sniffing the air for illegal hops. It's part comedy, part survival, part theater, and beneath it all lies the strange truth. In the old Swiss Confederacy, beer was never just beer. It was law, livelihood, and loophole all poured into one foamy mug. So if you ever sip a pint today, think of those medieval brewers balancing recipes against permits, hiding kettles under hay, or bribing a beer taster with an extra mug. And maybe whisper a toast to them, the unsung heroes who brewed under watchful councils, proving once again that no law, however strict, could extinguish the human thirst for a little comfort in a cup. You wander away from the tavern doors and brewing kettles, the night air sharp on your cheeks, and the narrow lanes soon give way to the stone outlines of churches and chapels. Their bells loom above you like sleepy giants, though not all of them are ringing, because even the bells, you learn, were regulated by law. In the old Swiss Confederacy, religion was everywhere, but so were the rules governing how loudly, how often, and even how cheerfully you could practice it. Step inside one of these churches in your imagination. The pews are simple, the air thick with beeswax smoke, and the choir murmurs hymns with a restraint that feels rehearsed. Because here, worship itself carried laws. For example, one mainstream fact. After the Reformation hit Switzerland in the 16th century, towns like Zurich and Geneva passed strict ordinances on church attendance. Citizens were legally obligated to show up on Sundays and feast days. Skipping service wasn't just spiritual neglect. It could earn you a fine. Imagine the awkwardness of the town clerk noting your absence and showing up on your doorstep with a bill. That'll be 3 pennies for oversleeping. The quirky twist? In some cantons, lateness itself carried penalties. Arrive after the opening hymn, and you might pay a reduced fine. Historians still argue whether these punctuality laws were widely enforced or more symbolic, but the records mention them enough to make you picture villagers sprinting down cobbled lanes, muttering prayers as they tried not to be fined for tardiness. Now, worship styles also mattered. During the Reformation, instruments were banned in many Protestant cantons, seen as distractions. Singing was permitted, but only plain psalms without elaborate melodies. That meant no fiddles, no drums, no jubilant choirs, just sober voices in unison. Councils even published hymn books to standardize what could be sung. Picture yourself yawning halfway through Psalm 23, wishing you could tap your foot, but remembering last week's dancing fine. On the Catholic side, the story twisted differently. Catholic cantons clung to festivals, processions, and elaborate rituals, but those too were regulated. Laws dictated which feast days were official holidays, when candles could be lit, and how much food could be consumed at church fairs. Too much feasting, the councils feared, would drain resources and encourage mischief. It's as if every saint's day came with a side of civic micromanagement. And then the bells, the eternal soundtrack of village life. Bells tolled to summon worshippers, to mark hours, to warn of fires, even to scare off storms. But the council stepped in here too. Some laws limited bell ringing at night, arguing that the noise disturbed sleep or spooked livestock. Others restricted who could order bells rung to avoid abuse of authority. Imagine a cheeky bell ringer fined for pulling ropes just to annoy neighbors at midnight. Yes, it happened. Another quirky tidbit. In some regions, bells were believed to chase away demons or disease. Councils allowed storm bells to be rung during bad weather, but only at approved volumes. Ring too enthusiastically, and you might get a warning. Historians still argue whether these rules reflected genuine belief in bells' supernatural powers or were simply attempts to curb overeager bell ringers who treated storms like free concerts. Attendance laws weren't the only headaches. Councils also banned certain behaviors during services. No whispering, no eating, no wearing hats. One record even mentions fines for leaning against church pillars too casually. Picture yourself trying to sneak a nap during a long sermon, only to be nudged awake by a stern deacon with a notebook. Sleep was apparently a punishable offense if taken at the wrong time. The seriousness could escalate. In reformed cantons, spies, were sometimes paid to report on neighbors skipping services or secretly attending Catholic masses. In Catholic cantons, the reverse applied. Suspicion fell on anyone dabbling with Protestant gatherings. Imagine the paranoia of worship, where even sitting in the wrong pew might draw gossip. Councils thrived on this surveillance, recording who prayed where, as if God kept double-entry ledgers. Yet, as always, people resisted. Some villagers snuck away to the woods, holding secret masses or singing forbidden hymns. Others bribed clerks to overlook their absence. And some simply claimed illness, though too many sick Sundays might trigger an investigation. You almost want to laugh. Imagine faking a cough to avoid church, then being interrogated by officials about the consistency of your phlegm. One mainstream debate among historians is how effective these religious laws really were. Did they produce genuine piety or just outward conformity? Records suggest both. Some towns saw remarkable discipline, others noted widespread grumbling and resistance. The laws shaped behavior, but they didn't always shape belief. Faith became a civic duty as much as a spiritual choice. The punishments weren't always harsh, but they carried weight. Repeat absentees might face public shaming, like sitting in the sinner's bench during service, while everyone else stared. More stubborn rebels risked exile or, in rare cases, execution for heresy. It's chilling to think that something as simple as preferring to nap at home could spiral into accusations of dangerous unbelief. Yet humor peeks through. One chronicle tells of villagers fined for laughing during a sermon. Apparently, someone sneezed so loudly the whole pew erupted. Another story describes a man fined for bringing his dog to church after the animal howled along with the psalms. These moments remind you that even in a web of rules, people found ways to be irreverent, intentionally or not. So, as you drift along these cobblestones, you picture bells chiming softly in the dusk, pews filled with villagers pretending to be alert, and clerks scribbling notes about who was late. Religion wrapped itself around every corner of life, but with it came endless little restrictions, some serious, some silly, all deeply human. And you think to yourself, faith here wasn't just between you and heaven. It was between you, heaven, and a council clerk with very tidy handwriting. You wander out of the churchyard, leaving behind the echo of bells and the watchful eyes of clerks with quills. The path takes you toward the edge of the village, where clusters of wooden homes lean against each other like weary friends. Smoke drifts from chimneys, shutters creak, and behind every door lies something surprisingly fragile: marriage law. You wouldn't think tying the knot required so much paperwork, but in the old Swiss Confederacy, unions were policed with the same intensity as cow brands or beer brewing. Picture yourself, young and smitten, ready to marry your sweetheart under the alpine sky. You'd think all you need is love, maybe a blessing from the pastor, but no, you also need the council's permission. And not just a nod of approval. Councils issued marriage licenses, controlled dowries, and could flat out refuse a union if they thought it wasn't suitable. One mainstream fact: by the 16th century, Swiss towns like Zurich and Basel made marriages contingent on proving you had the financial means to support a household. Love without money? Illegal. Imagine standing before officials, sweaty-palmed, while they ask how many goats you own before letting you kiss the bride. The quirky side comes when you realize how far they took it. In some cantons, couples were forbidden to marry if their combined dowry didn't meet a minimum threshold. Councils feared that poor couples would produce more poor citizens, leading to more beggars. Historians still argue whether these laws genuinely protected communities or simply reinforced inequality. Either way, your wedding plans could collapse because your grain sack was too small. And speaking of dowries, those weren't just gifts from parents. They were meticulously recorded, sometimes guarded by the council itself, and occasionally locked into town treasuries for safekeeping. Think of it like a medieval escrow account. If disputes arose, the council could seize or redistribute the dowry. So even in your most intimate commitments, bureaucrats hovered, quills in hand. Then came the bans on unequal marriages. Noble couldn't marry peasant, Protestant couldn't marry Catholic, and sometimes even citizens of rival cantons were forbidden from wedding each other. Marry across the line, and you risked fines, annulment, or exile. Imagine sneaking across mountains just to whisper vows in secret, knowing the council might hunt you down like runaway teenagers. Love stories in the Confederacy had all the makings of soap operas, minus the dramatic soundtrack, plus a lot more cheese. There's also the fascinating bit about parental consent. In some regions, parents had the legal right to block their children's marriages indefinitely. Even adult sons and daughters, if they lived under their father's roof, needed approval. Refuse too many times, though, and disputes sometimes ended up in court. Yes, imagine suing your dad because he wouldn't let you marry the baker's daughter. Historians still debate how often courts sided with children over parents, but the very existence of such cases shows how entangled councils were in family life. And don't forget the bans on cousin marriages. In Catholic areas, canon law prohibited unions within 4 degrees of kinship. Protestant cantons often enforced similar rules, sometimes even stricter. Councils hired officials to investigate family trees, ensuring no hidden cousin love slipped through. Picture the poor clerk flipping through parchment charts, groaning, "Sorry, your great-grandmother's brother's cousin ruins this one." Next. Punishments for illegal marriages could be humiliating. Couples caught marrying without permission might be paraded through the marketplace, forced to wear symbolic chains or even donkey ears. Others had their weddings annulled, leaving them both disgraced. More lenient towns fined them heavily, which still stung, and if children were born from such unions, they risked being labeled illegitimate, barred from inheritance. You realize quickly, love wasn't just complicated, It was perilous. Of course, people found ways around it. Some eloped to border towns with laxer laws, marrying quickly before word spread. Others bribed officials to look the other way or forged paperwork. There are even stories of mock weddings, performed by friends pretending to be priests, followed by real vows in private. It's equal parts romantic and absurd, risking exile just to exchange rings. One quirky tidbit: certain cantons banned weddings during specific times of the year, like Lent or Advent. Religious calendars dictated civic life, so no matter how ready you felt, you couldn't wed until the holy season ended. Imagine waiting months, pacing anxiously, because your love was postponed by a liturgical schedule. Councils enforced it strictly, sometimes raiding homes to catch secret ceremonies. Historians still argue whether these bans were meant to preserve sacred seasons or just give officials more leverage over communities. And yet, despite all these obstacles, marriages happened. Families maneuvered, councils compromised, and love found cracks in the walls. Couples bent rules, parents relented, and sometimes even officials turned a blind eye. Because no matter how many ordinances were passed, the human heart refused to be fully legislated. Picture a candlelit room in a timber house. A bride nervously adjusts her dress, her dowry chest sitting nearby like a silent judge. Outside, the groom fidgets, clutching a council-stamped license as if it were holy scripture. Guests whisper about fines, dowries, and inheritance, while the pastor drones through the vows. And in that moment, between bureaucracy and eternity, the couple squeezes each other's hands and smile. It makes you wonder, were they thinking about council rules, or just the warmth of each other's palms? So you keep walking through the village lanes, passing homes where families argue over dowries, where fathers debate consent, and where young lovers dream of escaping it all. The laws may have tightened every knot, but love, like water, always found a way to flow around the rocks. And perhaps, in that stubborn resilience, lies the truest rebellion against the council's tidy ledgers and signatures. You leave behind the wedding feasts and dowry chests, stepping into the crisp air where the village paths begin to widen into open fields again. At first, you think you're safe from rules, just grass, fences, and the quiet shuffle of peasants sowing seeds. But then you notice the stakes driven into the earth, each one marking boundaries, and you realize even the soil beneath your boots was wrapped up in regulation. In the old Swiss Confederacy, farming wasn't simply a matter of plowing where you pleased. Councils drew invisible lines across every meadow, dictated how crops could rotate, and punished anyone who dared to plant outside the rules. One mainstream fact: by the late Middle Ages, communal fields were common in Switzerland. Villages shared open land, divided into strips allotted to households. Councils or village assemblies enforced crop rotations to avoid soil exhaustion. 1 year wheat, another year barley, then a fallow rest. You couldn't just decide to grow turnips on a whim. If the rotation schedule said barley, you planted barley, or else you risked fines. Historians still argue whether this system truly maximized yields or just enforced conformity, but it shaped the landscape for centuries. The quirky side emerges when you see how specific these laws became. Some towns passed ordinances banning people from harvesting before a bell rang on the official day. Yes, a literal bell told you when to cut your wheat. Imagine waiting nervously with a sickle in hand, eyeing golden fields, until the church tower chimed permission. Cut too early, and you could face penalties, because early harvesting risked disputes and accusations of greed. The entire village, in theory, rose and reaped together, like a synchronized dance, but with more back pain. And then came grazing rights. Cattle, goats, and sheep were the lifeblood of alpine villages, but pastures were finite. Councils set strict quotas on how many animals each household could graze. Too many cows, and you'd overgraze the meadow, leaving neighbors furious. So every head of livestock had to be counted. Again, more paperwork. You might remember the branded cows from before. Now imagine clerks tallying not only ownership, but also where each beast could graze, and for how long. Stray too far onto a neighbor's pasture, and suddenly you owed fines or sparked a feud that might last generations. Another layer of law: fences. In some cantons, farmers were legally required to maintain boundary fences at certain heights. Too low, and your goats might leap into forbidden crops. Too high, and you'd be accused of hoarding space or blocking communal paths. Picture inspectors walking around with measuring sticks, scolding villagers for improper fence etiquette. Historians still argue whether these rules promoted fairness or just generated endless neighborly squabbles. And then there was wood. Forests in Switzerland were precious, providing fuel, timber, and construction material. Councils passed strict laws on when and how villagers could cut trees. Often, you needed permission slips for every cartload of logs, and unauthorized chopping could lead to hefty fines. There are even records of men caught cutting firewood illegally, being sentenced to plant replacement saplings under guard supervision. A medieval reforestation program, if you like. Of course, people found creative loopholes. Farmers might accidentally graze animals beyond quota by claiming they miscounted in the fog. Others cut timber at night, hauling logs through back paths. And some planted forbidden crops in hidden corners, hoping inspectors wouldn't bother trekking into remote strips. Picture a farmer tucking contraband cabbages between legal barley rows, chuckling to himself. These small rebellions against council control gave everyday life a mischievous edge. The punishments, though, could be brutal for repeat offenders. Fines stacked high, livestock confiscated, or land seized outright. In rare cases, stubborn violators were exiled, sent away for refusing to follow farming ordinances. Imagine being banished for growing the wrong vegetable. A comedy to us, but a tragedy then, when losing your land meant losing your life. And the harvest festivals, while joyous, came with their own rules. Councils regulated the amount of grain that had to be delivered to communal storage before families could keep their share. These granaries served as emergency reserves, but they also gave councils leverage. If you were late delivering your quota, expect a fine or public shaming. Villagers sometimes grumbled that the council ate better bread than anyone else. Historians still argue whether these stores were fair lifelines or instruments of control. One quirky tidbit: some ordinances prohibited singing bawdy songs while reaping. Apparently, cheerful tunes distracted workers and encouraged laziness. Imagine being fined for humming too happily while swinging your scythe. It sounds absurd, but councils feared that wasted effort could doom winter supplies. So yes, even your playlist came under regulation. You picture a harvest morning, villagers lined up with scythes, waiting for the bell. Dew soaks your boots, and tension hums louder than the crickets. Then the bell rings, and suddenly hundreds of blades sweep through golden fields in unison. It's beautiful and eerie, like choreography imposed by law. And in the background, council clerks hover, counting loads, scribbling notes, making sure no one takes a single stalk more than allowed. Modern parallels creep in. Think zoning laws, fishing quotas, building permits. The obsession with regulating land and resources hasn't vanished. It just wears a different suit now. But back then, the control felt more intimate, as if every furrow of your plow carried a council's fingerprint. And yet, despite the rules, life persisted. Families laughed in fields, children chased grasshoppers, goats ignored fences. Human creativity always found cracks in the walls. Maybe you'd sneak an apple from a forbidden orchard, or graze your cow a little too long on lush grass, trusting no one would notice. These tiny rebellions weren't just survival, they were the seasoning in an otherwise bland dish of regulation. As you leave the fields behind, the rhythm of scythes and the echo of the bell fade, and you realize, even in the soil itself, the Confederacy wrote its laws. And you can't help but think, did wheat really taste sweeter when it was illegal? You wander deeper into the village square, expecting more rules about soup or spoons, but instead, you hear the strangest murmur. A courtroom bell tolls, not for a thief or a quarrelsome neighbor, but for a pig. Yes, you blink, rub your ears, and still the sound remains. A full judicial trial convened for an animal. Welcome to one of the quirkiest and most unsettling corners of the old Swiss Confederacy's legal landscape, the animal trials. One mainstream historical fact: across parts of medieval and early modern Europe, including Switzerland, animals were occasionally brought before courts and tried as if they were humans. A sow that killed a child might face formal charges of murder. A goat that damaged property could be fined, or rather, its owner could, though sometimes the goat itself was symbolically punished. Records exist of pigs being executed, chickens being accused of sorcery, and insects being excommunicated from church lands. Historians still argue whether these trials were sincerely meant as justice, or whether they were elaborate rituals to reinforce human control and moral order. You picture the scene: a crowded courtroom, villagers craning their necks, and in the middle of it all, a bewildered pig tethered by rope. The judge, robed and solemn, reads charges in full Latin. A clerk dips quill into ink, dutifully writing, "Accused one sow of the crime of manslaughter." The absurdity makes you smile, but for the villagers, it was no laughing matter. The law demanded that evil deeds, no matter who or what committed them, be acknowledged and punished. The quirky tidbit here is that animals sometimes had defense lawyers. Imagine being a medieval attorney, earning your bread by defending a rooster accused of laying an egg. One famous case outside Switzerland involved precisely that. A rooster supposedly laid an egg, which was believed to be the work of the devil, a sign of witchcraft. The defense argued that nature sometimes produced anomalies, and that punishing the bird was unfair. Historians still argue whether the court ever truly believed the rooster guilty, or whether the spectacle was more about reassuring the public that order, cosmic, spiritual, and social, remained intact. In Swiss valleys, trials could involve insects too. Locusts swarming crops might be summoned to court by proclamation, warned to leave within a certain time or face excommunication. Yes, a literal curse from the church was aimed at bugs. Picture solemn priests, incense burning, chanting Latin formulas condemning caterpillars. It sounds theatrical. But villagers believed such rituals could protect harvests. You, standing in the square, suppress a chuckle at the image of beetles squirming under legal threat. Of course, the punishments for larger animals could be grisly. A pig, convicted of killing, might be hanged or burned, just like a human criminal. Sometimes the punishment matched the crime in a symbolic way. An ox that gored might be slaughtered publicly with a spear. To modern ears, it feels cruel and bizarre. But for medieval villagers, it reinforced that even animals were bound to moral order. The atmosphere in these trials must have been tense and carnival-like at once. Villagers gathered, children whispered, markets stalled as people crowded to watch. This wasn't just about justice. It was a kind of theater, a ritual of fear and reassurance. You can almost smell the hay mixed with candle wax in the courtroom, hear the snorts of the animal, feel the strange silence as the verdict is read. Sometimes, though, mercy appeared. Records show cases where animals were acquitted. A donkey accused of kicking a man might be declared innocent if witnesses testified that the victim had provoked it. Insects, too, were occasionally granted safe pastures. Priests would designate a specific field where bugs could go unmolested, as though negotiating real estate with caterpillars. It sounds absurd, yet it reveals how law, religion, and superstition intertwined in daily life. You think about the layers here: control of nature, fear of chaos, need for spectacle. These trials weren't about rational justice as we see it. They were about dramatizing order in a world where famine, disease, and disaster constantly lurked. If a child died from a pig's bite, punishing the pig gave the grieving family and the wider community a sense that justice had been served. That evil, no matter how irrational, was not free to roam unchecked. Historians still argue whether villagers believed the animals were truly culpable or whether these rituals were symbolic performances for the public. Some scholars suggest the real targets were the owners, who were shamed or financially ruined. Others say it was an attempt to reassure people that God's moral order extended even to beasts. And some skeptics propose that councils enjoyed the spectacle simply because it distracted from more serious grievances, like taxes or political disputes. Imagine yourself sitting on a hard wooden bench during such a trial. The judge drones on, the defense lawyer makes a solemn speech about animal instinct, and you feel your eyelids droop. A yawn slips out. After all, it's the middle of the day, and you're watching a goat stand trial for nibbling cabbages. The boredom mixes with disbelief until suddenly the sentence comes down: exile, execution, or forgiveness. The crowd gasps, and you wake up again, marveling at the blend of theater and law. There are even notes of humor preserved. One anecdote tells of beetles being excommunicated but refusing to leave, so villagers concluded the insects must be under demonic protection. Another story mentions cats suspected of witchcraft simply because they slinked through shadows. You can't help but grin, imagining a medieval jury squinting at a perfectly innocent tabby cat and whispering about dark forces. And yet, beneath the laughter, there's unease. These laws show how fragile medieval life felt, how desperately people sought explanations and rituals to keep misfortune at bay. If the crops failed, someone, or something, had to take the blame. Better to drag a goat into court than admit that nature itself was unpredictable. You step away from the square, leaving behind the echoes of bells and laughter, the strange mix of justice and pantomime. You carry the image of a pig in chains, a rooster defended by a lawyer, and bugs facing excommunication. The old Swiss Confederacy may have prized order, but its laws sometimes blurred into theater, and theater blurred into belief. As twilight creeps across the valley, you wonder, if insects could be cursed and pigs hanged, what else might end up in court before the Confederacy's judges? Perhaps you'd better watch your step. After all, you wouldn't want to be accused of disturbing the peace with too much laughter. You leave the courthouse still shaking your head at the sight of a pig in chains, and you drift toward the tavern on the corner, hoping for something less absurd. But as soon as you step inside, you find yet another oddity waiting: gambling laws. The air smells of stale beer and smoke, and you notice dice clattering across a wooden table. Men cheer, coins scatter, and just as quickly a bailiff bursts in, shouting about illegal gaming. Welcome to the world where rolling dice could be considered a crime. But betting on cabbages sometimes slipped through the cracks. One mainstream historical fact: throughout much of medieval and early modern Switzerland, councils repeatedly banned gambling. Dice and card games were often forbidden, especially in taverns, because authorities worried about moral corruption, drunkenness, and debts leading to feuds. Ordinances sometimes allowed gambling only at certain festivals or under strict monetary limits. Historians still argue whether these prohibitions were effective or mostly symbolic, since records show gambling resurfaced in every generation despite repeated crackdowns. The quirky detail is how specific the laws became. Some cantons explicitly banned dice games like hazard, even mentioning the names of dice combinations in their ordinances. Others restricted playing cards on Sundays or during harvest season, fearing that men would skip fieldwork for tavern tables. You imagine a weary council member scribbling yet another ban, muttering, "No, Hans, you may not gamble away your ox on a Tuesday night." And yet, behind closed doors, dice rolled anyway. Peasants and townsfolk found creative substitutes. If dice were outlawed, why not wager on cabbages? Accounts survive of villagers betting whose vegetable would weigh more at market, or whose goat could reach a post first. Picture the scene: two men, each clutching a cabbage, slamming them onto a scale while neighbors cheer. The stakes might be a jug of beer, maybe a loaf of bread. Technically not dice, so could they really be fined? It's the kind of legal loophole that would make any lawyer proud. Historians still argue whether such vegetable gambling was widespread or just exaggerated in anecdotes. But it illustrates how people bent rules while trying to avoid punishment. After all, entertainment options were limited. No Netflix, no pinball, not even bingo night. If the council banned dice, people found joy in the next closest thing, even if it meant cheering over the girth of a beat. Another layer of gambling law involved animals. Rooster fights, dog contests, and even races between oxen were occasionally subject to prohibitions. Some towns banned animal betting outright, while others tolerated it as long as the wagers stayed modest. You picture villagers gathering in a meadow, coins jangling, as two stubborn goats butt heads. Laughter erupts, coins change hands, and everyone pretends the council isn't watching. But the councils did watch. Bailiffs were tasked with raiding taverns, seizing dice, and arresting gamblers. Punishments ranged from small fines to public shaming, and repeat offenders could face exile. One record even notes dice being ceremoniously burned in the town square as though they were dangerous relics. Imagine villagers watching solemnly as little cubes of bone and wood crackled in the fire. It's almost comical, yet it carried the weight of law. The irony, of course, is that some council members themselves gambled in secret. You can almost hear whispers. "Don't tell anyone, but the mayor lost 3 shillings on a hand of cards last night." Enforcement was uneven, and favoritism crept in. If a respected burgher rolled dice quietly, perhaps nobody noticed. But if a poor peasant did the same, he risked the lash of the law. Sometimes gambling laws collided with festivals. During Fastnacht, the raucous pre-Lenten carnival, people often played forbidden games openly. Councils tolerated it for a few days, perhaps recognizing that cracking down too hard would spark riots. So for a brief window, dice rattled, coins clinked, and laughter filled the streets legally. Then, when Lent began, the hammer fell again. One particularly odd tidbit: some ordinances banned gambling specifically after sundown. Apparently, dice in daylight were less sinful than dice by candlelight. You chuckle, imagining bailiffs barging into taverns, squinting to see whether the last ray of sun had dipped behind the hills before shouting, "Aha! Illegal!" The absurdity almost overshadows the seriousness of punishment. As you sit in the tavern, you picture peasants sneaking looks over their shoulders, clutching coins nervously. The barkeep wipes mugs, pretending not to see the dice rolling under the table. Someone coughs as bailiffs pass by outside. The tension feels theatrical, like a cat-and-mouse game between councils and citizens. Historians still argue whether councils truly feared moral collapse from gambling or whether they simply disliked losing control of money flows. Dice debts could destabilize households, leading to unpaid taxes or family disputes. On the other hand, banning games also kept taverns under tighter council authority. The truth probably lies in both, a mix of genuine worry and political convenience. And you, drifting through this scene, can't help but compare it to modern vices. Lotteries, casinos, online betting, they're all regulated today, but none ever fully disappear. Just like villagers once bet on cabbages, people now invent creative loopholes. The game always survives the ban. Eventually, the tavern quiets. The bailiffs leave, the dice vanish, and laughter fades into whispers. A farmer sighs, stroking his cabbage like a prized coin. You realize that even in the old Swiss Confederacy, joy found ways to sneak through cracks in the law. And sometimes, the law itself looked so absurd that it made rebellion irresistible. So you step back outside, night air cool against your face. Behind you, faint laughter lingers, the sound of cabbages settling a bet. You shake your head, smile, and wonder, would you risk a fine for the thrill of rolling dice in the shadows? Or would you be the one betting on vegetables just to stay on the safer side of absurdity? You wander away from the tavern with its cabbage wagers still echoing in your ears, and soon you arrive at the edges of the settlement, where cobblestones give way to dirt paths. Here you find gates, not grand city gates of stone, but humble wooden barriers guarded by men in rough coats. Their job? To stop foreigners, or at least to decide what tolls outsiders must pay. Welcome to the old Swiss Confederacy's prickly relationship with strangers. One mainstream historical fact: the Confederacy, stitched together by cantons and alliances, was notoriously cautious about letting outsiders settle. Foreigners could be required to pay higher taxes, purchase permits to stay overnight, or prove they had local sponsors. In some towns, newcomers were forbidden from buying property unless they had lived there for decades. Historians still argue whether this was primarily about protecting scarce resources or about maintaining political autonomy, but the effect was the same. If you were not born within the Confederate valleys, life was complicated. You stand at the gate and imagine a weary traveler, boots caked with mud, pleading for entry. The guard demands coins for a stranger's toll, which might be triple what locals paid. Inside the town, rules multiplied. Foreign craftsmen had to register with guilds, often paying inflated fees or being barred from practicing their trades altogether. Marriage to a local? That required council approval and sometimes steep payments. Integration wasn't impossible, but it was expensive. One quirky tidbit appears in records of inns. Some cantons required innkeepers to keep separate rooms for foreigners, as if their presence might somehow taint locals. Imagine trudging for miles, finally reaching a warm tavern, only to be told you must sleep in the foreigner's loft, drafty and cold. You'd cough in the straw, wondering why your accent condemned you to such hospitality. Councils even debated how long foreigners could stay in one place before being forced to move along. Too long, and they risked being labeled vagrants or spies. And spies were no laughing matter. Switzerland's patchwork of alliances and enemies meant paranoia was constant. A harmless merchant might be accused of carrying news to rival cantons or foreign dukes. To prevent this, some villages required visitors to declare their business at the town hall. You picture a tired peddler, sack over his shoulder, forced to recite exactly why he came. Selling buttons, nothing more. The clerk scribbles notes, suspicious eyes narrowing. Historians still argue whether these declarations were effective security measures or just bureaucratic pageantry. Another angle of restriction involved religion. During the Reformation and the bitter splits between Catholic and Protestant cantons, suspicion of outsiders deepened. Councils sometimes barred those of the wrong faith from staying overnight without explicit permission. You might be perfectly harmless, but if you prayed differently, you could be denied bread at the market or lodging at the inn. Imagine the awkwardness. You buy a loaf, the baker hears your accent, asks your faith, and suddenly the bread is sold out. And yet, despite restrictions, foreigners kept coming. Merchants carrying salt, spices, or cloth braved tolls because Swiss markets were lively. Soldiers, too, arrived in droves, foreign mercenaries seeking contracts, or recruiters trying to lure Swiss men abroad. Councils eyed them warily, often passing laws against foreign recruiters, fearing their young men would vanish to fight in distant wars. Still, the recruiters came, cloaks swirling, promises glittering, sometimes chased out of town by angry mobs. The contradictions of Swiss law showed here. On one hand, suspicion of foreigners. On the other, an economy partly dependent on them. Inns, markets, and fairs all thrived on outside goods. Councils tried to square the circle with endless ordinances. Yes, foreigners could sell wares, but only on certain days. Yes, they could rent rooms, but only for limited stays. Yes, they could walk the streets, but only with toll receipts in hand. You imagine guards peering at crumpled papers, muttering, "This says you can stay until Thursday, stranger. Don't push your luck." Some rules went further into the absurd. In one canton, travelers were forbidden from singing loudly at night, lest their unfamiliar songs disturb local peace. In another, foreigners couldn't fetch water from communal fountains without paying a fee. Picture a weary traveler, bucket in hand, stopped by a bailiff demanding coins before he could quench his thirst. A joke to us, but for him it meant choosing between hunger and humiliation. The social consequences were heavy. Foreigners often formed little clusters, clinging together in shared misery. Imagine a corner of town where the guest houses lined up, full of accents, laughter, and grumbles in a dozen tongues. Councils might turn a blind eye as long as these groups stayed quiet, but suspicion never truly lifted. One sneeze too loud, and someone would mutter, "Foreign plague bringer." Historians still argue whether such restrictions kept Swiss communities safer or merely fostered isolation. Some claim it prevented overcrowding and resource strain. Others argue it stifled cultural exchange and innovation. You, standing at the gate, sense both truths hanging in the air: protection and paranoia, safety and small-mindedness woven together. And yet, for all their barriers, the Swiss couldn't shut out the wider world entirely. Foreign coins jingled in pockets, exotic fabrics brightened markets, and strange tales flowed in with every traveler. Children probably ran to hear stories of distant seas, even if their parents frowned. And perhaps, secretly, even the sternest counselor enjoyed tasting foreign wine smuggled past the tolls. So you leave the gate behind, the sound of toll bells echoing in your ears. You picture yourself as a traveler, fumbling coins, explaining your purpose, shivering in the foreigner's loft. It's a reminder that laws meant to protect often wound with equal sharpness. In the old Swiss Confederacy, suspicion of outsiders was carved into wood and ink, shaping every weary step across the border. And you can't help but smirk, imagining yourself fined for singing too loudly by a fountain. Stranger, pay your fee, or move along. You walk back into the town proper, past the toll gates and the suspicious looks cast at strangers, and soon your ears pick up another kind of irritation. It's not the clang of dice in taverns, nor the moo of cattle at pasture. No, this annoyance comes from the ground itself, the echo of clogs, boots, and shoes across cobblestones. The old Swiss Confederacy had laws for nearly everything, and of course, they extended even to the noise of your footwear. One mainstream historical fact: in many Swiss towns, during the late Middle Ages and early modern period, sumptuary laws regulated not only clothing but also accessories, including shoes. These rules often targeted wooden clogs or heavily nailed boots that clacked loudly on stone streets. Councils insisted such noise disrupted the peace, particularly at night, and they issued ordinances forbidding certain soles or mandating quieter materials. Historians still argue whether this was about maintaining civic order, protecting sleep, or simply enforcing class distinctions, since noisy, flashy shoes often became symbols of status. You picture yourself trudging through a narrow alleyway, your clogs clicking like castanets. The echo bounces between timbered houses, rattling shutters. A counselor sitting inside grimaces, mutters about youths these days, and the next week an ordinance appears. No more clacking shoes after dusk. Suddenly, Your footwear is a matter of legal concern. The quirky tidbit? In some towns, people were fined if their shoes squeaked too loudly in church. Imagine kneeling in prayer, the sacred silence heavy, and then, squeak, your boot betrays you. Heads swivel, whispers stir, and before you know it, the Beatles escort you out. Yes, even squeaks could be criminalized. You feel your lips twitch, but for the people then, it was deadly serious. Silence in worship reflected community discipline, and discipline extended to fashion. Certain shoe colors, trims, or exaggerated points were banned for common folk. Those flamboyant poulains, the pointy shoes fashionable across Europe, were sometimes outlawed in Swiss towns because they were seen as arrogant or wasteful. If you strutted with tips, curling like fishing hooks, the council might accuse you of showing off above your station. You remember the clothing restrictions from before, and here they extend down to your very toes. Historians still argue whether these bans were really about noise and modesty, or whether they were subtle ways of keeping lower classes in their place. After all, fancy footwear could blur social lines. A peasant in bright shoes might look suspiciously close to a merchant, and the councils were eager to preserve distinctions. Quieter, simpler footwear meant both literal peace and symbolic hierarchy. Picture the nightly scene. Townsfolk shuffle home after curfew bells. Wooden clogs smack the stones, a dog barks, a baby cries. Soon, inspectors patrol, listening for offenders. They aren't measuring fence heights this time. They're counting echoes. If your steps rang out too sharp, a knock on your door might follow, along with a fine. You imagine trying to defend yourself. It wasn't me, sir. It was my cousin's boots. But the ink is already flowing in the clerk's book. The absurdity deepens when you learn that some places allowed exceptions for festivals. On feast days, clogs could clack with abandon, music drowned the noise, and councils turned blind eyes. But once the bells ended, back came the rules. One day you're free to stomp joyfully in a parade. The next, you risk fines for the same stomp. It's like living with a permanent noise curfew strapped to your feet. And then there's the problem of winter. Wooden clogs were practical in snow, and hobnailed boots gave traction on icy slopes. Yet both were noisy. Villagers grumbled that the council cared more about silence than survival. Some quietly wore banned shoes anyway, muttering that frozen bones mattered more than a frowning counselor. Enforcement was uneven. In remote valleys, practicality often trumped laws. But in town squares, inspectors were vigilant, measuring noise with ears sharpened by boredom. The humor almost writes itself. Imagine a farmer sneaking across cobblestones in socks to avoid fines, shoes tied around his neck. Or a mischievous youth deliberately hammering extra nails into his boots to create thunderous echoes, just to annoy elders. Some ordinances explicitly mention excessive nails as forbidden. Apparently, teenagers have always found ways to irritate authority. And let's not forget the shoemakers. They bore the brunt of these laws, forced to adjust designs constantly. Councils sometimes dictated how thick soles could be, what materials to use, or how many nails were allowed. A shoemaker caught selling noisy shoes risked punishment too. Imagine their grumble in workshops. Today they ban nails, tomorrow they'll ban laces. What's next? Walking barefoot. Yet there's a philosophical layer as well. Silence was not just convenience, it symbolized order. Towns prided themselves on calm, disciplined streets. Too much clatter suggested chaos, a breakdown of harmony. In that sense, banning noisy shoes wasn't only about sound, it was about civic identity. Historians still argue whether these small laws reflected a deeper obsession with control, where even footsteps were molded by authority. You stroll through a market in your mind, hearing the rhythm of shoes, the soft slap of leather sandals, the muted pad of felt boots, the occasional scandalous clack of a clog. Merchants glare at offenders, mothers hush children, and bailiffs circle like hawks. The entire town becomes an orchestra where every footstep must play its part, or risk a sour note and a fine. As you drift from stall to stall, you can't help but smile. Shoes, of all things, became instruments of politics, class, and law. And, while the rules may sound silly now, you sense the seriousness beneath, an anxious society seeking peace, order, and distinction in every corner of life. Finally, you turn down a quiet lane. Your steps echo softly, safely, within legal limits. Yet you imagine what it would be like to wear forbidden clogs, stomping defiantly, noise bouncing like laughter off the walls. Would you risk the fine just for the joy of being heard? Maybe. After all, what's the point of shoes if not to leave a mark? You leave behind the sound of clogs clacking and squeaking boots reprimanded in church, and now your gaze drifts upward. Above the tidy roofs of half-timbered houses, you notice windows, some wide, some narrow, some strangely bricked up. At first, you think it's random, a result of repairs or clumsy masons. But no, in the old Swiss Confederacy, even the number of windows in a house was a matter of law. Councils taxed them, regulated them, and neighbors squabbled endlessly about them. Welcome to the strange world of window ordinances. One mainstream historical fact. Across parts of early modern Europe, including Swiss towns, houses were taxed by the number of windows or the size of openings. This was not unique to Switzerland. The famous window tax existed in France and Britain too, but Swiss cantons applied their own versions. Windows were considered luxuries, so families with many were expected to pay more. Historians still argue whether these taxes encouraged fairness or merely punished comfort, since bricked-up windows still scar buildings centuries later. Imagine living in a cramped alpine village, your family gasping for fresh air in smoky rooms. You ask the mason to cut a bigger window, but then a bailiff appears, measuring frames with a stick and demanding higher taxes. The absurdity strikes you. Light and air, the simplest of blessings, monetized by councils desperate for revenue. You picture whole families squinting in gloom because an extra window might bankrupt them. The quirky tidbit? Some communities accused neighbors of adding spite windows. These were tiny openings cut high into walls, not for air, but to spy on adjoining yards or to glare at rivals. Councils sometimes banned them outright, calling them quarrel windows. You grin, imagining two old women leaning out of tiny square holes, hurling insults across narrow alleys. The law, of course, swooped in to restore peace. No more windows unless approved, lest feuds spiral into chaos. And windows cause privacy debates too. In a world without curtains as we know them, every new opening invited suspicion. If your neighbor added a window overlooking your garden, you might march to the council and demand it be blocked. Picture the council scribbling yet another ordinance. No householder shall make new openings that disturb the peace of his neighbor. Historians still argue whether these rules were about genuine privacy or just another excuse to collect fees. Window taxes also tied to heating. Larger windows meant more heat loss, so authorities claimed taxing them discouraged waste of scarce firewood. It sounds reasonable, but skeptics note councils themselves often enjoyed large, airy halls, exempt from such fees. The double standard was obvious. Peasants shivered in dark huts, while officials basked in sunlight. Picture a clerk trudging from house to house, counting windows. He squints at each one, notes it in a ledger, and sometimes pokes walls with a stick to check whether frames are bricked shut or just disguised. Families occasionally sealed windows with mortar before his arrival, then reopened them later. It became a cat-and-mouse game, light itself hidden from taxation. Some towns grew notorious for half-blocked facades, streets lined with uneven patches where windows once existed. Travelers wrote about the gloomy appearance, comparing it to faces, missing eyes. You, strolling down such a lane, feel the strangeness. A town designed less for beauty than for tax evasion. And then came quarrels. If one family bricked up windows to avoid taxes, their house might cast extra shadow on a neighbor's. Suddenly, disputes arose. Your wall makes my kitchen too dark. Councils had to mediate, sometimes forcing compromises like shared openings or compensation payments. Imagine the paperwork, daylight negotiated like property. The absurd humor writes itself. Imagine a bailiff scolding a farmer. You owe 2 florins for that new skylight. The farmer protests. It's just a hole where the roof leaks. The bailiff, unmoved, adds a fine for sarcasm. Meanwhile, children peer through a hidden peephole, giggling at the inspector's back. Windows even tied into morality. Some preachers warned that too many openings tempted sin, allowing immodest glances or idle staring at the street. Laws occasionally echoed this, discouraging vanity windows that faced marketplaces. You chuckle at the idea of a council declaring, less gazing, more working. Historians still argue whether these ordinances truly raised significant revenue or mostly irritated citizens. Some records suggest window taxes filled coffers handsomely. Others imply widespread evasion. What's certain is that resentment festered. For families already burdened by grain quotas, livestock tallies, and clothing restrictions, being taxed for sunshine felt like insult added to injury. And yet, windows remained symbols of pride. A house with many gleaming panes announced wealth. Glass itself was costly, so most peasants relied on oiled parchment or shutters. Councils noticed, of course, and targeted glass owners with heavier taxes. It's the medieval equivalent of taxing luxury cars. You imagine neighbors whispering, "That family can afford glass. No wonder they pay double." Envy baked itself into the bricks. Some window disputes lasted generations. Old complaints resurfaced whenever renovations occurred. Your grandfather cut a window overlooking my stable, now you want another? Councils kept dusty ledgers of such grievances, ready to arbitrate. The phrase, "never forget a window," might as well have been local wisdom. You picture yourself standing in a dim cottage, a single slit letting in light. Smoke swirls from the hearth, your eyes water, and you sigh, wishing for another opening. But you know the cost. Fines, grudges, endless council hearings. So you endure the dark, grumbling about how even the sun is regulated. And then you step outside, blinking at bricked-up facades, realizing how deeply laws carved themselves into the everyday. Shoes silenced your steps, Windows rationed your light, and neighbors measured grievances one pane at a time. Would you risk a fine for fresh air? Or seal yourself into shadows to save a few coins? That choice, in the Confederacy, defined not just your comfort, but your reputation in the eyes of neighbors and council alike. You leave behind the narrow lanes of patched windows and step into the noise and bustle of a Swiss market day. The smell hits you first. Sharp onions, earthy carrots, tang of fresh cheese, and the unmistakable waft of animals in straw. You wander among stalls where every position, every crate, every shout seems oddly disciplined. That's because, in the old Swiss Confederacy, markets weren't just free-for-alls. They were heavily choreographed by law, with councils deciding who stood where, who sold what, and even how loudly you could hawk your goods. One mainstream historical fact: Swiss towns had market regulations dating back to the late Middle Ages, and many of them were remarkably detailed. Town councils, often made up of guild representatives, enforced ordinances that dictated the placement of goods, weights, and measures, and even the time when the market officially opened. Historians still argue whether these rules encouraged fair trade or mainly protected local guild monopolies. Imagine you're a carrot farmer who's hauled your produce down from a hillside village. You want a sunny spot in the square, but no, the ordinances decree vegetables go on the north side, away from butchers and cloth sellers. Chickens must be tethered near the fountain, pigs not at all, unless it's swine day. And if you try to sneak your carrots into the prime cloth section, a bailiff shoos you back, ledger in hand. The absurdity is clear. It's like medieval musical chairs, only with radishes. A quirky tidbit: some markets even banned selling fish on certain days to protect the river. You picture the contradiction. Fish swimming happily, because the calendar says so, while frustrated vendors grumble over unsold catches. Others banned the sale of garlic too close to bread stalls, apparently because the smell was overwhelming. It's an oddly sensory kind of regulation, as if civic harmony depended on controlling odors. And of course, weights and measures were a battlefield. Councils provided official stone weights and standardized bushels chained to posts in the marketplace, so no one could tamper with them. You imagine buyers sneaking glances, making sure a vendor's scale aligns with the public reference. The law was merciless. If caught with a false weight, your goods could be confiscated, and sometimes you had to parade through town carrying the offending scale as a humiliation. It's basically medieval shaming by Yelp review, but with more cowbells. Historians still argue whether these inspections reduced fraud or just created more bribes. Records show bailiffs often took samples of wine or cheese to ensure quality, but suspiciously, these samples were usually generous. You can almost hear a farmer muttering, "That inspector drank half my barrel checking it." The market also served as a stage for morality. Councils banned drunken brawling, dice games, and sometimes even music, fearing markets would turn into carnivals. Yet despite the rules, you imagine jugglers slipping in, children chasing geese, and musicians strumming discreetly until an official barked them away. The tension between order and chaos was constant, a square full of life, yet always shadowed by fines. Picture yourself at a bread stall. A woman in an apron lays out loaves, but she's nervous. Bread laws already punished bakers for size and weight, and on market day, inspectors hovered. If a loaf seemed too small, it might be seized in front of the crowd. Yet bread also had to be displayed prominently, so families couldn't hide subpar goods. It's a tightrope act. Bake generously or risk ruin. And then there's cloth. Guilds fought bitterly to maintain dominance, demanding ordinances that only guild members could sell textiles. Outsiders risked confiscation or heavy tolls. You imagine a traveling merchant slipping into town with bright silk, only to have it seized because he lacked permission. The irony? Locals often bought confiscated goods from the council itself at auction. The cycle of control and profit was complete. A quirky example: in some towns, foreigners could only sell until noon, after which locals had the market to themselves. You imagine the mad rush. Foreigners hawking wares desperately before the bell rang, then guards ushering them out like stagehands clearing scenery. It's almost comical, yet livelihoods depended on beating that clock. And of course, animals caused drama. Chickens clucked and darted, sometimes escaping into cloth stalls. Pigs squealed loudly, violating the noise ordinances. Dogs wandered, chasing after scraps, and sometimes faced fines if they weren't tethered. One ordinance amusingly demanded that cattle be brushed before entering market to prevent embarrassment of the town. You chuckle at the thought of farmers frantically combing cows before dawn, hoping to avoid civic shame. Markets also became arenas of gossip and surveillance. Neighbors watched who bought what, who paid too much, who couldn't afford anything. Adding to that, councils sometimes posted guards to keep people from lingering idly, as if chatting too long with a carrot seller endangered civic stability. Historians still argue whether these measures kept order or simply fed the obsession with control. Picture yourself squeezing between stalls, clutching a basket. The crowd pushes, vendors shout, officials scribble fines, and bells ring to mark opening and closing. A cheese seller thrusts a sample at you. Strong, tangy, but you wonder if the inspector will confiscate it later. Nearby, a cloth merchant complains bitterly about guild monopolies, while a child chases a runaway goose under a butcher's table. It's chaos, but a choreographed chaos, humming under the weight of laws. And when the day ends, the square is swept, litter gathered, and inspectors tally the fines. Councils smile, order preserved, coffers filled, and the illusion of fairness maintained. You, however, can't help noticing the unevenness. Guild members thriving, peasants sweating under restrictions, foreigners chased out. The market reflects the Confederacy itself, alive, noisy, creative, but endlessly regulated. Would you dare to break the rules, sneak your carrots into the cloth section, sell fish on the wrong day, or let your cow wander unbrushed? If so, you'd better be ready to pay the price, or face the spectacle of public shame. You shuffle out of the market square, ears still buzzing from the shouts of vendors and clattering hooves, and you notice how suddenly the atmosphere changes once Sunday dawns. The same cobblestones that yesterday echoed with commerce now lie strangely hushed. The bells ring, not for sales but for worship, and you see doors bolted, shutters drawn, and townsfolk walking stiffly toward churches. Because in the old Swiss Confederacy, Sunday was not a day for leisure in the modern sense. It was a day heavily policed by laws, ordinances, and suspicious eyes, making sure you weren't having too much fun. One mainstream historical fact: across Swiss cantons, Sabbath regulations grew stricter in the 16th and 17th centuries, influenced both by Catholic reformers and especially by Reformed Calvinist zeal. Councils passed ordinances banning work, commerce, games, and even casual amusements on Sundays. Historians still argue whether these rules reflect genuine piety or were mainly a tool for civic discipline. Imagine waking up on a Sunday morning in a wooden chalet. The sun creeps in through your single window, you stretch, and your first thought is, finally, a free day. But then you remember the law. No bowling, no dancing, no games with dice, no drinking parties, no wandering idly down the lane humming tunes. Suddenly, Sunday feels less like freedom and more like detention. The quirky tidbit. In some villages, authorities specifically banned loud laughter on Sundays. Not only games or music, but even laughter itself, if deemed excessive. You picture yourself giggling at a joke about cows and being hushed by a neighbor with a frown. Not today, it's the Lord's Day. The absurdity is striking, joy regulated, as if cheer itself threatened the soul. And yet, councils were serious. Fines existed for playing ball games, for fishing, for spinning wool, for even walking in fields if it looked too leisurely. You imagine a bailiff hiding behind a hedge, watching for signs of unlawful happiness, his quill ready to jot names. He sees children kicking a ball, leaps out, and lectures them about eternal damnation, followed, of course, by a monetary fine payable to the council chest. Historians still argue whether enforcement was as strict as the laws suggest. Some records show endless lists of fines. Others reveal frequent lapses, with people defiantly dancing in barns or gambling in taverns. The tension is clear. Laws intended to force devotion often produced secret rebellion. Picture yourself sneaking into a barn on a Sunday afternoon. The hay smells sweet, beams creak above, and villagers gather for a forbidden dance. A fiddler plays softly, feet tap cautiously, and everyone glances nervously at the door. The music swells until a bailiff storms in, demanding silence. The fiddler hides his bow, someone coughs awkwardly, and you all pretend you were just stacking hay. It's both comical and suffocating. Some ordinances were oddly specific. In Zurich, records show bans on bowling on Sundays, but also bans on watching bowling, as if spectatorship itself corrupted morals. Elsewhere, playing cards was restricted, with fines doubling if play occurred during church hours. Imagine an unlucky villager, not only fined for playing, but for losing badly too. And what about food and drink? Taverns technically remained closed during morning services, yet owners often bent rules, pouring ale behind shuttered doors. One anecdote describes inspectors barging into a tavern only to find drinkers feigning sleep at tables, mugs hastily hidden under benches. You grin, imagining the awkward silence, until a loud hiccup betrays the whole charade. Quirkier still, some cantons banned outdoor strolls with too much joy. What does that even mean? Picture yourself walking with a bounce, humming, and suddenly someone accuses you of joyfulness. You insist you were merely stretching your legs, but the council isn't convinced. How does one measure joy? Perhaps with a frown-o-meter. Historians still argue whether these strict Sunday laws improved devotion or simply alienated people. Sermons certainly lasted long, with some records noting 3-hour services. Parishioners squirmed, children fidgeted, and the temptation to sneak off for games grew irresistible. Authorities knew this, hence the constant patrols. There's also the economic side. Councils feared Sunday markets or labor would disrupt order. By banning work, they kept commerce predictable and reinforced their control. Yet peasants often needed Sunday to mend tools or tend fields. For them, Sabbath laws felt less about piety than about power, an added burden on top of daily survival. Still, Sunday wasn't entirely bleak. Families gathered for meals after church, sharing stews, bread, and stories. But even here, rules hovered. Drinking too much could trigger accusations of Sabbath breaking. And heaven forbid if your singing grew too cheerful around the hearth, neighbors might report you. You can almost hear the whispered warnings. Keep it down, the bailiff's cousin lives next door. The most ironic part? Council members themselves were sometimes fined. Records tell of aldermen caught playing cards or enjoying a sly drink on Sundays. The laws were strict, but hypocrisy thrived. It's reassuring, in a cynical way. Even those writing the rules couldn't resist a good laugh and a mug of ale. You picture yourself trudging back to your lodging after a stiff church service, resisting the urge to skip or whistle. The streets are quiet, shutters closed, the air thick with restraint. Somewhere, faint music leaks from a barn, followed by hurried silence. Sunday in the Confederacy is less a day of rest than a day of surveillance. Would you obey, keeping joy bottled up until Monday, or risk a fine for laughter, for dance, for daring to kick a ball? Either way, you'd feel the weight of laws pressing down on your leisure, turning even happiness into a regulated act. You leave behind the stiff pews of Sunday, the muffled laughter, and the endless vigilance of neighbors, and now you step into a different sort of scrutiny, the naming of children. In the old Swiss Confederacy, even this most intimate choice was wrapped in rules, restrictions, and, more, in a little suspicion. Parents had to walk a narrow path between family tradition, religious authority, and civic law. One wrong turn, and you could face fines, disapproval, or even accusations of disrespecting God Himself. One mainstream historical fact: in early modern Switzerland, names were tightly linked to saints, biblical figures, or prominent local families. Parish registers reveal strict patterns. Most children were baptized with names drawn from an approved pool. Historians still argue whether councils imposed naming rules to strengthen Christian devotion, or simply to keep records manageable in small, tightly knit communities. Picture yourself holding a newborn, cheeks red, wrapped in a rough wool blanket. You want to give the child a unique name, perhaps something fanciful from a story, or an ancestor who wasn't exactly saintly. But no, when you present the baby to the priest, he raises an eyebrow and demands, "Which saint is this?" If you say something like moonlight or forest, he might shake his head sternly and refuse. Yes, even names needed council approval, and creativity was punished. The quirky tidbit? Some records mention fines for naming children after foreign heretics, or even after local troublemakers. Imagine trying to honor your cousin Hans, only to be told, "No, he once shouted at the bailiff, so Hans is forbidden." Or worse, picking a name like Martin during the Reformation and being accused of smuggling in Lutheran sympathies. You laugh softly at the absurdity. A baby becomes a political statement before it can even crawl. And then there was the battle of spelling. Parish clerks often insisted on Latinized forms, turning little Peterly into Petrus in the register. Parents grumbled, but the clerk's quill ruled supreme. Historians still argue whether this was a way to enforce uniformity or simply a matter of clerical pride. Either way, you imagine families whispering the affectionate nickname at home, while the official record bears a name that sounds stiff and foreign. Names also tied into inheritance. Some councils encouraged firstborn sons to be named after grandfathers, ensuring continuity of family lines. Deviating from this could spark disputes later. Picture a lawyer in court declaring, "This land belongs to Hans, son of Hans, as tradition demands." But what if you dared to name him after Uncle Rudolph instead? Suddenly, the chain of proof weakens. A name wasn't just a word, it was a legal anchor, and woe betide parents who chose duplicate names within the same household. In some parishes, two living children couldn't both be called by the same saint, lest confusion reign. Yet in others, if one child died young, parents often recycled the name for the next newborn. It sounds grim, but names carried symbolic weight, as if repeating them might carry forward the lost child's spirit. Quirky as it sounds, some towns outlawed diminutives in official registers. No Ueli for Ulrich, no Lisi for Elizabeth. Councils feared nicknames would clutter records or confuse tax lists. You imagine a bailiff snapping, "How can I tax Lisi? Show me Elizabeth or pay double." Bureaucracy marches on, even through baby cradles. Historians still argue about how strictly these laws were enforced. Surviving registers reveal the occasional oddity, children named after weather events, after animals, even after accidents of birth. One record lists a boy named Föhn after the warm alpine wind. Was this defiance or just rustic humor? Either way, the priest must have sighed heavily, dipped his quill, and hoped nobody higher up noticed. The laws also had a social function. By sticking to saints' names, communities reinforced religious identity. Outsiders with strange names stood out instantly, marked as foreigners or troublemakers. In some cantons, newcomers even had to rename their children to conform, erasing old traditions. Imagine arriving from Italy with a son called Giovanni, only to be told he must be Johannes from now on. A bureaucratic baptism, whether you liked it or not. And then there were the fights between parents and godparents. Godparents often insisted on naming rights, especially if they were footing part of the baptismal feast. Arguments broke out at church doors. "He shall be Jacob." "No, my uncle's name was Matthias." The priest, exasperated, sometimes chose himself, writing whatever name fit best in his register. You picture bewildered parents walking home, muttering, "We wanted Anna, but somehow she's Maria now." The humor creeps in when you imagine a rebellious villager sneaking in a forbidden name. Perhaps someone named their daughter Venus, just to shock the priest. The priest might scowl, scratch it out, and replace it with Verena, the closest saint. Poor Venus grows up never knowing her brief life as a goddess lasted only one ink stroke. But underneath the comedy lies real pressure. A name defined identity, lineage, and belonging. Councils used laws to shape families, priests used registers to shape piety, and neighbors used gossip to enforce conformity. If your child bore a wrong name, whispers followed. Did you mean to rebel? Were you mocking tradition? Was the child doomed to carry suspicion? You, standing in that candlelit church, baby squirming in your arms, would feel the weight of centuries pressing down. Choosing a name seems simple, but in the old Swiss Confederacy, it was another test of obedience. You nod politely, pick from the approved list, and hope your child one day forgives you for the lack of originality? Would you risk a fine or the priest's wrath just to give your child a unique name? Or would you bow to the system, repeating the same saints and grandfathers, letting individuality be swallowed by order? In this society, even naming a baby was never just a personal choice. It was a civic act, written in law and guarded by ink and authority. You step away from the hushed baptisms, the ink-stained registers, and the whispered arguments over saints' names, and now your ears catch a new sound: barking. Not wild barking, though, measured, muffled by collars and bells. Dogs everywhere, from the streets of Zurich to the mountain paths of Uri, were themselves subject to a tangle of ordinances. In the old Swiss Confederacy, even your loyal mutt couldn't escape the long arm of civic regulation. Collars, leashes, bells, yes, bells, were mandated, fined, and argued about endlessly. One mainstream historical fact: records show that many Swiss towns issued ordinances about dogs, partly to protect livestock, partly to prevent bites, and partly because dogs were used in hunting and herding, activities tightly regulated by guilds and councils. Dogs were taxed in some cantons, and keeping one without paying dues could result in confiscation. Historians still argue whether these dog laws were primarily about public safety or about extracting more revenue from ordinary folk. Imagine walking into a village square with your scruffy farm dog trotting at your side. Before you even tie him to a post, a guard eyes you. "Where's the collar? Where's the bell?" he asks, quill already poised for a fine. You fumble in embarrassment. Your dog's collar snapped last week. Too late. The law doesn't forgive, even for a broken strap. Your poor mutt, guilty of collarlessness. The quirky tidbit. In some places, bells were required so people could hear a dog approaching in narrow alleys. Picture little copper bells jingling with every wagging step, an entire street filled with canine chimes. It's charming in theory, but less so when you're trying to nap and a chorus of jingling echoes through town. You imagine villagers muttering, "That's Hans's dog again," jingling past at midnight. And leashes. Yes, medieval leash laws were a thing. Ordinances demanded dogs be tethered in public, especially near markets or churches. A loose dog could scatter chickens, snatch sausages, or cause panic. You grin at the thought of a preacher pausing mid-sermon to scold, "Who let their hound into the nave again?" Historians still argue whether these strict leash and bell rules were enforced consistently. Some documents show regular fines for noncompliance. Others suggest that wealthier households flouted the laws with impunity, their sleek hunting dogs trotting free while peasants' mutts jingled under scrutiny. And yes, there were dog taxes. Councils often charged households for each dog, sometimes higher for hunting breeds, lower for farm dogs. The tax served a dual purpose: raising funds and limiting dog populations. Families too poor to pay might have to surrender their pets. Imagine the heartbreak. Children crying as a beloved dog is hauled off because the fee went unpaid. You shake your head, realizing that even loyalty and companionship had a price. Some towns also specified dog duties. Herding dogs were permitted, but required special markings on collars. Hunting dogs could only be kept by guild members with licenses. Stray dogs were seized and sometimes put on trial. Yes, actual trials, much like pigs or goats. The records describe judges solemnly declaring punishments for biting without cause. You can't help but laugh at the image of a confused mutt in a courtroom, tail thumping on the floor. The absurd humor continues. One ordinance required dogs in Zurich not to bark excessively at night. Imagine a bailiff marching to your house at midnight. Your hound barked thrice too many. Fine due by dawn. How exactly do you tell a dog to hush under penalty of law? Perhaps with extra sausages as hush money. Collars themselves became status symbols. Wealthier families outfitted their dogs with decorated leather or even metal collars, while peasants tied bits of rope. Naturally, councils taxed the fancy ones more. You picture a proud noble showing off a mastiff with a gleaming brass collar, jingling loudly, while a farmer mutters, "That collar costs more than my cart." And bells weren't just for noise. Some records say bells helped distinguish owned dogs from strays. If a dog wore no bell, it could be seized as ownerless. You picture peasants rushing to tie jingling contraptions to even the smallest puppies, just to prove ownership. Entire litters tinkling like a troop of miniature sheep. Historians still argue whether bells also symbolized submission. Some scholars see them as practical, others view them as ways to humiliate common folk, forcing them to advertise their pets every step. After all, nobility sometimes exempted themselves, letting their hounds roam silently while peasants endured constant jingling. The inequality rings, literally, in your ears. There were even ordinances about dog waste, though phrased delicately. Dogs were not to soil certain streets or markets, and owners could be fined if caught. You grin, realizing medieval Switzerland invented an early version of the modern scoop the poop rule. Only then, it wasn't plastic bags. It was shame and fines. And then there's the role of watchdogs. Some laws actually required farms to keep at least one dog for protection, especially in border regions. But here's the catch. Watchdogs still needed bells, so thieves could often hear them coming. You chuckle at the contradiction. Laws designed to protect often undermined the very purpose. Picture yourself walking through an alpine village, dogs everywhere, some jingling politely, others straining at leashes, a few noble hounds strutting silently, their collars shining. Inspectors wander the streets, checking collars, counting bells, and noting taxes owed. Children giggle as their puppies clink like cowbells, while grumpy farmers mutter about fees. It's a symphony of control, a chorus of regulation wrapped around every wagging tail. Would you obey, strapping a bell to your dog and paying the tax? Or risk fines for letting your mutt run free, barking joyfully into the night? In the Confederacy, even man's best friend walked not by instinct alone, but by ordinance, quill, and council decree. You wander now toward the end of your long, winding stroll through the labyrinth of Swiss ordinances, and instead of dogs with bells or noisy pigs with trials, your path brings you to something far subtler, almost invisible. It is the world of guild secrecy, the rules that bound bakers, butchers, weavers, and smiths in knots of whispered codes and tightly locked workshops. You realize that in the old Swiss Confederacy, laws weren't always written with trumpet flourishes or church bells. Some of the most controlling were tucked quietly into the statutes of guilds, pressed like dried herbs between parchment. One mainstream historical fact. By the late Middle Ages, Swiss towns like Zurich, Basel, and Bern were dominated by guilds, associations of craftsmen and merchants who controlled training, production, and sale of goods. They wrote statutes as binding as any civic law, often enforced with fines or expulsion. Membership wasn't optional if you wanted to ply a trade. It was compulsory, and along with it came the burden of guild rules. Historians still argue whether guild secrecy protected quality and tradition, or whether it mainly served to block competition and enrich insiders. Imagine yourself as an apprentice baker. You rise at dawn, the smell of yeast and smoke clinging to your clothes, and yet before you even knead a loaf, your master reminds you, remember the secret. Recipes, oven timings, flour mixtures, all guarded like treasure. Share them with an outsider. Even whisper them in a tavern after one too many mugs of ale, and you could face expulsion, fines, or worse, lifelong disgrace. You chuckle softly, because it sounds like an early form of non-disclosure agreements, only with more bread and less legalese. The quirky tidbit? In some guilds, apprentices were required to take symbolic oaths involving candles, tools, or even animal parts, swearing never to reveal trade secrets. You picture a wide-eyed youth clutching a rolling pin while chanting solemn vows, his future hinging on a promise of silence. The ritual might seem absurd, but to them, it bound the apprentice as tightly as chains. And secrecy wasn't just about recipes or techniques. Guilds sometimes forbade their members from discussing prices with outsiders. The logic was to prevent undercutting and maintain stable markets. So, if you ask too many questions about the cost of bread in Basel, you might earn suspicious glances and muttered warnings. Price lists were circulated internally, like secret bulletins of hush-hush numbers. Of course, guild secrecy also created fertile ground for conspiracy theories. Historians still argue whether guilds intentionally inflated prices, forming miniature cartels. Some scholars see them as guardians of skill, others see them as cozy clubs of middlemen hoarding wealth. You imagine peasants rolling their eyes. No wonder the bread costs so much. The bakers are whispering again. And then there were punishments. Break secrecy and you could be forced to pay heavy fines, sometimes even paraded as a warning. In Zurich, a disgraced member might be excluded from guild feasts, which sounds mild, until you realize those feasts were major social events. To be denied a seat at the long table, beer frothing, roasts steaming, laughter echoing, that was social exile. In a world where reputation mattered more than coin, exclusion was devastating. Some guilds went further, demanding apprentices wander abroad for years before becoming masters. Known as the Wanderjahre, these journeys prevented secrets from leaking locally. But even on the road, apprentices were watched. Letters of recommendation had to be stamped by guild elders, proof you hadn't betrayed the trust. You picture yourself trudging across Europe, boots worn thin, carrying not just tools, but also silence, guarded like a relic. And secrecy had odd side effects. Because recipes and methods were locked away, innovation sometimes stalled. Historians still argue whether Swiss guild secrecy slowed technological progress compared to regions with looser rules. Yet, paradoxically, when secrets did leak, through runaway apprentices or stolen notes, whole industries transformed. Imagine the thrill of an outsider finally cracking the secret cheese mold, and suddenly, new markets blossomed. Humor creeps in too. One chronicler joked that butchers were so secretive they wouldn't even tell their wives how many cows they'd slaughtered. Picture a spouse asking, "So, how was work?" And the butcher answering cryptically, Plenty of stakes, none of your business. Marital bliss, indeed. You notice also how secrecy blended with ritual. Guilds staged processions where symbols, keys, locked chests, sealed scrolls were paraded through town. Outsiders saw mystery, insiders saw power. Bells rang, banners waved, and yet the message was clear. We know something you don't. It's the medieval equivalent of exclusive club membership, complete with velvet rope. Only the rope was forged from silence and oaths. And think of the daily tension. You, an apprentice weaver, tempted to impress a tavern friend by describing a dye mixture. One slip, one too bright boast, and suddenly you're summoned before elders, accused of betrayal. You stand in a smoky hall, elders' eyes narrowing, quills poised to write your punishment. Your stomach knots tighter than your loom threads. The secrecy stretched beyond trades into politics. In some towns, guild councils deliberately hid financial records from non-members. Decisions about taxes, wars, or markets were wrapped in coded minutes, guarded from ordinary townsfolk. Historians still argue whether this secrecy shielded stability or bred resentment that later fueled Swiss rebellions. Either way, you sense how secrecy wasn't just a rule, it was a tool, shaping power itself. And here's the ironic joke. While guilds obsessed over keeping secrets, neighboring towns often had nearly identical methods. The guarded bread recipe in Zurich tasted suspiciously like the guarded bread recipe in Basel. Yet still, apprentices sweated under vows, punished for revealing what everyone already half knew. You shake your head at the futility, chuckling softly. Finally, picture yourself leaving the guild hall, the air thick with smoke and whispered warnings. Keys jangle as chests are locked, candles flicker out, silence descends. You carry with you not just knowledge, but also fear of fines, exclusion, disgrace. In a world where law bound not only your body, but also your tongue, every loaf of bread, every bolt of cloth, every mug of ale came seasoned with secrecy. And just as you settle into that thought, the jingling dogs, the fined pigs, the taxed bells, and the censored songs of earlier sections drift back to your memory. You realize the old Swiss Confederacy wasn't just about quirky laws. It was about the invisible threads binding daily life. Every step, every bite, every word carried a weight of ordinance, a reminder that freedom was always measured, always conditional.